24 missiles, 7 tons each one faster than sound. And in the air, they sorted out among themselves who goes down first, without a single command from the ground. One submarine, and across from it, a carrier, a floating city, 100,000 tons, ringed by a whole escort of guard ships. That submarine cost about 10 times less than the thing it was built to sink. Think about it. One salvo, and on the seabed lies a target worth 10 times the price. It was built for one job: kill the carrier. And for that, the missiles in its salvo were taught to gather into a swarm. The swarm has no commander. It picks its own target. Who taught metal to think like this? And why was it trusted to a single lone submarine? The swarm chose its own target. And what carried that swarm was a machine like this: 154 meters, a 50-story building laid on its side and lowered underwater. Submerged, she weighs around 24,000 tons, the mass of a small cruiser, except a cruiser floats in plain sight, while this shadow moves in the deep and says nothing. In the Navy, they had a fond name for them: loaves. A huge black hull, smooth, bulging slightly at the sides, really does look like a loaf of bread if you see it from the pier, a homey nickname. But the loaf's job was anything but homey. One boat like this was meant to go up against a whole carrier group, not against a ship, against the group, a floating airfield, and around it cruisers and escort destroyers, aircraft in the sky, the depths swept by sonar for tens of kilometers. To charge something like that head-on is suicide. And it was right here, into this impossible task, that the Soviet Union poured its answer. The answer was cold and calculated. Don't build your own carriers in reply. Too expensive, too slow. Build the thing that sinks the carrier. The military called it an asymmetric response. You spend a ruble where the enemy spent 10, and you send his 10 to the bottom anyway. The man who carried this design through to steel went by the name Baranov. Igor Baranov, an engineer from the Leningrad bureau Rubin. He didn't take on the project from a blank page, and not at an easy moment. But more on that later. There's a story of its own there, and it's not as glorious as one might wish. For now, remember the name, Baranov. The first boat of the series was given the number K525 and the name Arkhangelsk. She entered service at the end of 1980. That's where it all began. That's where the count of these underwater giants started. And here I have to admit something to you. One boat from this series you almost certainly know, by name. It's tied to a disaster that made headlines around the world. But today the talk isn't about the tragedy. Today it's about why these giants were built at all, and what they were capable of. We'll come back to that story carefully, closer to the end, and I'll explain why I don't make it the center of this one. If these are the stories you're after, not the loud headline, but what lies behind it, subscribe. Without this channel, they just get lost in the noise. Now, about what this behemoth lacked. For all her power, she had a blind spot, and it runs through our whole story. The boat could strike beyond the horizon, hundreds of kilometers out. But to see the target across those hundreds of kilometers on her own, that she could not do. Her eyes weren't her own. Whose they were, we'll get to separately. And a story surfaces there that the naval textbooks don't print. The second thing to keep in mind, they intended to build around 18 of these boats, a whole fleet of carrier killers. They built 11. The series broke off, and there was a reason for that. But back to the main weapon. 24 missiles in her flanks. That's not just 24 barrels. It was a swarm taught to work as a single organism. And it all begins with one salvo. That very salvo, the designers believed there was no escaping. There was no escaping it because these missiles had no commander. They chose their prey themselves. Right there in the air, in seconds, without a single prompt from the boat. Even today, that sounds almost like science fiction. And this is the 1970s. 24 Granite missiles. Each lies in its own canister in the flank, between the light hull and the pressure hull, tilted forward at an angle of 40-some degrees. The boat fires its salvo, and from there it's out of her hands. The missiles are gone, sorting out the task without her. The military have a precise phrase for this: fire and forget. Now, about what those 7 tons of steel could do in flight, the Granite's range, by various accounts, runs from 550 to 625 kilometers. That's the distance from Moscow to Petersburg in a straight line. At high altitude, the missile accelerated to 2.5 times the speed of sound. Intercepting one is hard. It moves fast. It flies low on the final stretch, and there are many of them. And here's where the thing I started this whole conversation for begins. The salvo doesn't leave as a crowd. The missiles gather into a swarm and divide the roles among themselves. One rises above the rest. It's the spotter. From up high, its horizon is farther. It sees the enemy formation whole and hands the picture out to the entire swarm. Here's the main target. Here are the escort ships. This is how we go in. The others hold lower, right down by the water, where they're harder to spot. The swarm knows what it's hitting. Loaded into each missile's memory are the images of ships, how they look on radar. A carrier is large. It has its own signature, its own size, its own place at the center of the formation. From these signs, the swarm works it out. There he is, the main one. The rest are the entourage, second rate. And the missiles work by priority. Until the main target is struck, the swarm doesn't touch the secondary ships. No ship is attacked twice. No sense spending 2 missiles where one will do. The distribution happened on its own, automatically, by a flexible algorithm. In the West, they nicknamed the Granite the wolf pack for this habit. The name stuck, and it's apt. Wolves in a pack don't all lunge at the same prey either. And there's more. The swarm could bite back. The enemy throws up jamming, tosses out decoys, inflatable reflectors, electronic tricks to make the missile bite at the wrong thing. The Granite has its own gear for this. The missile sorts the false from the real and wages its own electronic warfare right there in flight. They tried to fool the swarm, and the swarm answered the deception. And the warhead. The Granite's standard warhead is a penetrator. It punches through the hull and tears the ship apart from inside. But there was a second option: nuclear. Here, the sources diverge sharply. Some speak of a yield of several tens of kilotons, others up to hundreds. The exact figure the military keep to themselves to this day. One thing is clear. A single such missile with a nuclear filling would have been enough not for a ship, but for the entire formation at once. Now it's time to name the man who dreamed all this up: Vladimir Chelomey. The designer whose bureau, back then it was called OKB-52, created the Granite. It was there that they gave steel this collective reason, the ability to divide up targets, to argue with jamming, to hold formation without a human. In the 70s, when a computer filled a room rather than fitting in your palm, making a flying missile think as a swarm was a task on the edge of the possible. Chelomey crossed that edge. But Chelomey's genius came with a problem from the very start, one the glossy articles don't mention. The swarm could divide up targets. It could filter out decoys. It could strike at the main one. One thing it couldn't do: find the carrier itself. From 600 kilometers, a missile has no eyes. Someone had to tell it. He's over there. And who whispered the coordinates to the swarm? That's a story of its own. A strange one, with a nuclear reactor in orbit and wreckage that came down nowhere near where they'd counted on. But before we head off into space, it's worth asking about something else. Chelomey dreamed up the missile. But who dreamed up the boat itself? The whole thing, from bow to propellers. The boat as a whole was dreamed up by a man who never saw her slip beneath the water: Pavel Pustintsev. He died in August of 1977, 3 years before the first hull entered service. He led this project from the very start, from the concept, from the drawings, from the moment when the carrier killer existed only on paper and in the arguments of engineers. Pustintsev headed the Leningrad bureau Rubin. Back then it went by a different name, but the essence was the same. These were the country's top people for submarines, nuclear missile carriers, strategic giants. It all came out of here. And the new project, that very boat with 24 Granites in her flanks, was handed to him to lead. The task was almost unbearable. They needed a ship that would haul this swarm of missiles across half the world, close on a carrier group to salvo range, and not be detected before its time. Stealth, enormous size, a nuclear power plant, all the gear for firing beyond the horizon, and all of it in one hull. Rubin alone couldn't manage this. On the lead ship, around 130 enterprises from all across the Soviet Union came together, and around 150 pieces of equipment that simply hadn't existed before, created for the first time, specially for this boat. Listen to that number again. 150 new designs, not parts, samples of weaponry and equipment, each of which had to be dreamed up, tested, brought to completion. Whole institutes worked for years for the sake of a single ship. Pustintsev held this entire behemoth in his head. He drew it all together. The drawings, the missile men, the nuclear men, the acousticians. A man on whose desk the threads from 100 factories converged. And he didn't reach the finish. August of '77, the project in full swing, the lead boat still under construction on the slipway in Severodvinsk, years from her first time at sea. The chief designer was gone. By the available accounts, he carried this work on to the very end. The project was taken over by another man, Igor Baranov, that very name I asked you to remember at the start. Baranov carried the boat through to steel, to water, to service. But the concept, the backbone, the very idea of this underwater giant, that's Pustintsev. One man took up the baton because the other didn't make it to the line. An ordinary story, really, for that era. People burned out on projects like this quietly, without loud words. A designer doesn't fall in battle and doesn't make the reports. He simply doesn't live to see the day he worked for. And that day was one of those that go down in naval history. When the lead ship was finally launched and entered service, it turned out that Rubin had built not just a boat, they'd built one of the largest submarines ever to move underwater at all. A colossus the likes of which the Navy had never carried before. And this colossus, she still had to be seen whole, from the outside, to understand just what the enemy was dealing with. 3.5 meters of empty space. That's how much sits between this boat's outer wall and the inner one, the one behind which the people live. A whole room's worth of space all the way around, along the entire hull. And it isn't a miscalculation, not dead weight left in by oversight. It's a design built on the assumption that the boat will be shot at. To understand why you'd want a gap like that, you have to work out how this colossus is built inside. She's a double hull design. There's an outer hull, the light one. It holds the shape, the streamlining. Water slides over it, and it's where those very granite canisters lie along the flanks. And inside it, a second hull, the pressure hull. That's the real boat, a steel tube that holds back the pressure of the deep, and inside it are the compartments, the people, the reactor, the weapons. The light hull can be punched through, the boat survives. The pressure hull cannot, that's the end. And between these two hulls, on the Antey, there are 3.5 meters. For a submarine, that's a lot, a great deal. Usually you're counting in tens of centimeters, a meter at most. Here, a full 3.5. What does that give you? First, a reserve of buoyancy. On this boat, it ran as high as 30%. Behind that figure is a simple thing. Punch through one compartment, let it flood, and the ship still doesn't go to the bottom. It has something to keep it afloat. An ordinary submarine dies from a breach like that. This one stayed in the fight. Second, protection. That same gap absorbs an underwater blast. A depth charge or torpedo goes off nearby. The shockwave first hits the light hull, spends its force on 3.5 meters of water and structures, and only then reaches the pressure hull, already weakened. Distance works like a cushion. The boat was built to take the hit and keep fighting. The logic here is combat through and through. She was meant for a mission you might not come back from. One ship against a carrier group, and around it, an anti-submarine defense whose whole job is to hunt and sink boats like this. So the boat has to endure hits. After the first blow, it mustn't sink. It has to see the job through to the salvo. 3.5 meters of empty space is the margin for surviving long enough. And now it's time to deal with one stubborn myth. These boats are often called titanium. A pretty word, an expensive one, sounds serious. Well, the Antey's pressure hull is steel, not titanium. Titanium was in the Soviet Navy, on other boats. There was the Lyra, a small, fast huntress with a titanium hull. There was the Komsomolets, the one that dove to a kilometer. Those really were made of titanium, and that's a separate engineering story. But the Antey is steel. Just steel of special grades. Strong, but steel. A giant hull out of titanium would have cost a fortune and been hell to build. So the myth is pretty, but it's a myth. And now, where all this grew. Severodvinsk, a city on the White Sea up north, where winter lasts half the year. This is home to Sevmash, the northern machine-building enterprise, the country's main yard for nuclear submarines. You couldn't just lay down a colossus like this in some old workshop. For these boats, Sevmash built a separate complex, a huge new boathouse, a covered hall where the hull was assembled section by section, and a floating dock to bring the finished giant out onto the water. A building berth for a ship 150 meters long is itself a structure the size of a factory. The lead boat was laid down on the 25th of July, 1975. From that day, on the slipway in Severodvinsk, the pressure hull began to grow, compartment by compartment. The Antey has 9 of them. 9 steel cylinders, each with its own purpose. Torpedo, living quarters, central post, reactor, turbine. They were welded, joined, packed with equipment, and all of it over years, under the northern sky, behind a guarded fence. The Navy had its own man watching over the construction. Chief Overseer, that was the title. On this boat, it was a captain by the name of Ivanov, Vladimir Nikolaevich Ivanov. The overseer is the customer's eyes and conscience at the yard. He accepts the work, he argues with the shipbuilders, he signs off that the ship is fit. Thousands of assemblies, hundreds of systems, and all of it has to pass through his exacting standards before the boat is handed to a crew. A thankless, unnoticed post. People like this don't make the papers, and without them, not one ship puts to sea. By the end of the 70s, a giant stood on the slipway. Steel, 9 compartments, 30% reserve buoyancy, 24 missiles along the flanks. Survivable, powerful, able to take blows and hit back across hundreds of kilometers. And for all that, with one flaw that crossed out half its strength, the boat had survivability. It had firepower, but with eyesight, trouble. This colossus could strike 600 kilometers out, yet across those 600 kilometers, it saw nothing on its own. A blind giant with a raised fist who doesn't know where to strike. Someone had to become its eyes, and those eyes weren't sought at sea, they were lifted into space. Space can wait. Before we deal with the eyes that were lifted into orbit, it's worth asking a simpler question. Why build such a giant at all? Expensive, loud, blind beyond the horizon. What logic justifies a bet like this? 226 million rubles. By mid-80s estimates, that's what one Antey cost. The figure is enormous on its own. You could build a small city with it, but it takes on a completely different weight when you set the cost of the target beside it. An American Nimitz-class carrier, the bare hull, no carrier aircraft, no crew training, ran about 10 times more. 10 Anteys or 1 carrier. It all started with that piece of arithmetic. Behind it stood a particular man. Admiral of the fleet of the Soviet Union, Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov. He led the Soviet Navy for nearly 30 years, from 1956 to 1985. For the Navy, Gorshkov isn't just a commander, he's the architect. The man who made the decisions that shaped the face of the fleet for decades ahead. What we build, what we don't, what weapons we fight with, what tasks we set our ships. When Gorshkov came to power, the Soviet Navy was, by and large, a coastal one. It operated off its own shores, in its own seas, mostly on the defensive. By the 80s, it was an ocean-going force, capable of a presence anywhere in the world's oceans, from the Mediterranean to the Indian, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That transformation is Gorshkov's doing, and at some point in that transformation, Gorshkov made a decision that sealed the Antey's fate long before the first drawing. The Soviet Union did not build carriers in answer to the American ones. It didn't chase a mirror image parody. The logic was hard and pragmatic. A full carrier isn't a ship, it's a system. You need a yard capable of building hulls like that. You need carrier aircraft, which the Soviet Union didn't have in the form required. You need decades of training pilots able to land on a deck in the open ocean. You need basing infrastructure, ports, docks, supply lines. America grew its carrier fleet over more than half a century since the end of the Second World War. To try to repeat that path in 10 or 15 years is a fantasy and a road to ruin. Gorshkov proposed something else. Don't catch up, zero it out. Don't build your own carrier, learn to sink the other man's. In military terms, This is called an asymmetric response. You don't climb into the same game, you change the rules. A carrier strike group is dozens of ships and aircraft, but it has a weak point that nothing can cover. It depends on a single ship. The carrier is the heart of the group. Destroy it, and the cruisers, destroyers, escort frigates lose their meaning. The carrier aircraft hang in the air with no deck to land on. One accurate strike voids the entire formation. Dozens of pennants and hundreds of machines. Back to the arithmetic. The Antey costs, by the available estimates, 1/10 the price of a carrier. The 24 missiles in its salvo were designed specifically for a carrier group. The swarm finds the main target itself. We went over that. If even part of the missiles reach the carrier, on the seabed lies something the enemy invested 10 times more in. Plus crew training, plus the air wing, plus decades of combat experience, all of it, on the bottom, for 1/10 the price. Let me qualify that. 226 million is an estimated figure. It turns up in open sources, but exact data on the cost of Soviet warships still isn't fully declassified. The 1-to-10 ratio is a benchmark, not an accountant's ledger. But the order of magnitude is exactly that, and the bet was placed on exactly that order. The Antey didn't work alone. Gorshkov built a system in which the submarine is one part of the strike, and the second came from the air. 222 M3 bombers, heavy supersonic machines of the naval missile-carrying aviation. They carried their own anti-ship missiles and approached the target at high speed at low altitude from a different direction. The plan called for a combined strike. From under the water, the granites from the boat, from the air, the missiles from the bombers, simultaneously, from different bearings, so that the carrier group's air defense would choke, unable to fend off everything at once. One boat and a few aircraft against a floating city and its escort. In money, pennies against a fortune. That's what an asymmetric response looks like in practice. Gorshkov saw further still. A carrier is a target that isn't only military. For America, the loss of a carrier is an event of national scale, a blow to prestige, to the sense of invulnerability, to faith in the fleet. The Soviet Union couldn't match the United States in the number of large ships, but it could create a constant, unavoidable threat to the enemy's most expensive and most symbolic ship. And that threat alone, even without a single launch, was enough to force the Americans to spend colossal resources on defense. Every time a loaf put out into the ocean, it set off a chain reaction on the other side. Patrol aircraft took to the air, anti-submarine ships changed their routes, carrier groups moved off their usual courses. Headquarters recalculated the risks. The Antey had never once fired in its life. And on the opposite side, the money was already burning. Keeping one loaf cost several times less than what was spent defending against it. Even in silence, without firing, this boat was working. Gorshkov built his fleet like a chess player. Not a pawn against a pawn, but a piece thrown straight at the queen. A cheap piece, worth 10 times less, but one that threatens the most important thing on the board. And as long as it stands on the board, the opponent is forced to play cautiously, to spend moves on defense, to divert forces. The perfect weapon. It works even when it says nothing. One problem. This cheap carrier killer was still left with the flaw we've spoken of more than once. Beyond the horizon, it was blind. The missile flies 600 kilometers, while the boat's own eyes see for tens of them. For all of Gorshkov's arithmetic to work, for the salvo not to go off into the void, someone had to show the boat the target. Show it from where the horizon hides nothing, from orbit. And up there, above, its own story was waiting, with a nuclear reactor in space and an ending no one had planned. A nuclear reactor in space. Not on a submarine, not on an icebreaker, on a satellite. In an orbit 270 kilometers above the Earth, where a failure means not an emergency shutdown, but a fall. And it was exactly this craft that became the eyes of the killer boat. So we've reached that running question I planted back at the start. What did the blind giant see with? The problem was simple and unsolvable by ordinary means. The Granite missile flies 550, and by some accounts, 600 plus kilometers. But the missile's own seeker head switches on only on the final stretch, when tens of kilometers remain to the target. The whole rest of the way, the missile flies on coordinates loaded in advance. And if those coordinates are inaccurate, the salvo goes off into an empty ocean. 24 missiles, 7 tons each, simply drop into the water, having found no one. A carrier group isn't a stationary object. It moves at 30 knots and constantly changes course. In an hour, it shifts more than 50 kilometers. That means the target's coordinates go stale within minutes. The boat has to know where the carrier is right now, at the moment of launch, not where it was an hour ago. And the boat itself is underwater. It won't raise its head and look past the horizon. A submarine's radar sees for tens of kilometers, not hundreds. A reconnaissance aircraft can be intercepted on the approach. A surface spotter ship can be detected and sunk. They needed someone who couldn't be shot down quickly, who sees the whole ocean at once, who passes the data straight to the boat submerged. A satellite. Only a satellite, but not an ordinary one. Optical imaging from orbit depends on weather and on light. Clouds, night, fog, and the camera goes blind. But the carrier has to be seen always, in any weather, at any time of day. That means you need radar. A radar set in orbit that scans the ocean's surface with radio waves and finds ships by their reflection. Clouds are no obstacle to it. Night is no obstacle. Radar demands energy, a lot of energy, nothing like a camera. Solar panels won't feed a radar like that, especially in low orbit, where the satellite spends half its time in the Earth's shadow. The solution they found was radical. They put a nuclear reactor on board the satellite, a compact nuclear power unit able to feed the radar at any point in the orbit, day, night, shadow, light. The satellite received the designation US-A, Controlled Active Reconnaissance Satellite, and the whole system, uniting such satellites into a constellation, was named Legenda, the Naval Space Reconnaissance and Targeting System, MKRT's Legenda, the world's first system that continuously scanned the world's oceans from space in the interests of a strike fleet. And here a name surfaces that we already know well, Vladimir Chelomey. That same Chelomey whose bureau, OKB 52, later NPO Mashinostroyenia, created the Granite missile with its collective swarm. It turns out he also built the eyes for that swarm. Alongside the development of the Granite, the creation of Legenda was underway in the same bureau, the sword and the eye, from one pair of hands. This is neither coincidence nor whim. Chelomey understood from the very start that a missile without targeting is a useless lump of iron. What's the point of making a swarm that can divide up targets if the swarm doesn't know where to look for them? The missile and the satellite were designed as a single whole, as two organs of one organism. Without Legenda, the entire Granite project would have been an expensive and useless machine. How it worked in practice. The US-A satellites flew in low orbit, around 270 kilometers. From there, the radar swept the strip of ocean below it and picked out large surface ships. The data went to a ground processing station where analysts determined, this looks like a carrier group. Here are its coordinates. Here's the course. Here's the speed. Then the data was passed to the submarine. The boat received it while submerged through special antennas, without surfacing, without giving itself away. Having gotten the coordinates, it brought the missiles onto the target and fired the salvo. The chain. The satellite saw, they processed, passed it to the boat fired, the swarm found, and finished it. The whole meaning of the carrier killer rested on this chain. Take the satellite out of it and the rest falls apart. The first time this chain was tested in action was on the 12th of June, 1974. The Northern Fleet submarine K-47 received targeting from the USA spacecraft and carried out a practice firing with a P-6 missile against a large ship target hulk. It hit. For the first time in history, a submarine struck a target beyond the horizon using data from space, not by the pre-known coordinates of a test range, but by a real cue from a satellite. This was the moment the system first worked as intended. The missile went off and arrived where the satellite had pointed. After this, over-the-horizon firings on Legenda data became standard practice. On the Northern and Pacific fleets, boats regularly fired at targets homing by satellite. The system worked, but Legenda had a weak point, and it was sewn into the design: a nuclear reactor in orbit. Low orbit means the satellite is dragged by the remnants of the atmosphere and gradually descends. When it has used up its service life, the reactor has to be separated from the body and lifted into a high disposal orbit, where it will circle for hundreds of years until the radioactivity subsides. This is a routine procedure. It was supposed to work every single time. In all, 33 such craft were launched under the program. 33 satellites with nuclear reactors on board, one after another, over nearly 2 decades. Each circled above the ocean, scanning for foreign ships and drawing power from its own reactor. Each, once spent, was supposed to carefully steer its radioactive core off to a safe altitude. You know what about all this gave the adversary no peace? These satellites were considered target number 1 in the event of war. Blind the satellite, and the boat loses its targeting, and the swarm of granites flies into the void. The Americans understood this, the Soviets too. Legenda was the most vulnerable link in the whole carrier-killer system. Expensive, complex, nuclear, and fragile. The system worked until the mid-2000s, when it was finally taken out of service, obsolete both in concept and in technology. A new system came in its place, Liana, with different satellites and without nuclear reactors. But that's already another era, and in the 70s and 80s, Legenda was the only way to guide the granite onto its target. Without it, the Antey was that very blind giant, powerful, survivable, but useless at range. With it, it became the thing it was built to be. Chelome created both halves of this weapon, the missile that thinks in a swarm, and the satellite that shows the swarm where to fly. 2 projects from one bureau, 2 instruments and 1 pair of hands. A rare case where a designer controlled the entire chain, from detecting the target to destroying it. And above the ocean, at an altitude of 270 kilometers, satellites with reactors circled quietly. Small, invisible from the ground, carrying white-hot uranium inside them. They did their work in silence, until one day, one of them stopped obeying commands and began to fall. It was falling on Canada. On the 24th of January, 1978, the satellite Cosmos 954, that very USA with a nuclear reactor on board, one of those space eyes that guided missiles onto carriers, entered the dense layers of the atmosphere and broke apart over the northwestern territories of Canada. Inside it were 37 kilograms of spent nuclear fuel, and all of it was coming down. What happened before the fall? The satellite was launched in the autumn of '77. Almost immediately after reaching orbit, something went wrong. The orientation system began to malfunction. The craft started losing altitude. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, tracked every object in orbit and fairly quickly noticed, this satellite is behaving abnormally. It's descending. By their calculations, within a few weeks it would enter the atmosphere. The Soviet side tried to save the situation. On a normal end of service, the reactor was supposed to separate from the satellite's body and go off to a high disposal orbit, rise to 800 kilometers and beyond, where it could circle for centuries until the radioactivity dropped to a safe level. But the boost system didn't work. The satellite was lost. Controlling it became impossible. All that remained was to wait and calculate where it would fall. Early on the morning of the 24th of January, the waiting ended. Over the Canadian wilds, over the empty snow-covered territories northwest of Yellowknife, a fiery trail streaked across the sky. Most of the satellite's body burned up in the upper atmosphere, but not all of it. The debris, pieces of structure, and, worst of all, fragments of the reactor, scattered across an enormous area. By various accounts, the dispersal zone ran from 100 to 124,000 square kilometers, an area comparable to that of a small European country, and all of it, empty, sparsely populated regions of the Canadian North. Tundra, taiga, frozen lakes. One person happened to be very close by, a kayaker, a young athlete, training on Great Slave Lake not far from Yellowknife. The fiery object streaked right over him. A few hours later, he went to a hospital in Yellowknife. The doctors who examined him weren't interested in the patient's nervous system. They were looking for the clinical signs of radiation sickness. A kayaker on a winter lake and a nuclear reactor from space. That's how lines converged that no one planned to bring together. Canada and the United States reacted instantly. A secret joint operation was launched. In Western sources, it appears under the codename Morning Light. In Russian-language ones, Morskoy Rasvet. Search teams in protective gear comb the snow-covered territory looking for debris. The work was carried out in the harshest conditions: frost, emptiness, vast distances, and on top of it, every fragment found might turn out to be radioactive. And fragments were found, of various sizes, from small pieces to sizable chunks of structure. Some of them carried such a level of radiation that, by the searchers' accounts, the debris burned through the snow cover around it. A metal piece lying on the snow, and around it, a thaw hole from the radiation. That image later drifted from article to article, and I'll say it plainly, not all sources describe it the same way. Some speak of heat radiation, some of a radiation background, but the fact itself, that highly active fragments were found on Canadian territory, is confirmed by both the Canadian and the Soviet sides. The Soviet Union admitted to the fall fairly quickly. TASS put out an official statement that said, "A Soviet satellite with a small nuclear device on board fell onto Canadian territory." A careful wording, a small nuclear device. Behind it stood a nuclear reactor, 37 kilograms of spent fuel, and a contaminated area the size of Bulgaria. Then the negotiations began. Canada presented the Soviet Union with a bill for cleaning up the aftermath, for Operation Morning Light, for the search work, for decontamination, for everything. The talks went on for several years. In the end, a protocol was signed. On Canada's side, it was signed by the ambassador to the USSR, Jeffrey Pearson. On the Soviet side, by Deputy Foreign Minister Nikolai Semyonovich Ryzhov. The USSR undertook to pay $3 million Canadian in compensation, a modest sum by the measure of an international incident. The Canadians had asked for more, but a payment is a payment. The Soviet Union paid for its fallen satellite. And do you remember this story? January of '78, a Soviet satellite with a reactor fell on Canada. Little was said about it in the Soviet press at the time, but rumors went around. If your family talked about this, if you remember something, write in the comments. I'd find it very valuable to read. After Cosmos 954, the Soviet Union had to suspend launches of such satellites for almost 3 years. The design was seriously reworked. They changed the emergency reactor separation system, added a mechanism for the forced ejection of the fuel elements, so that even if the boost to the disposal orbit failed, the radioactive parts would scatter in the upper atmosphere and not reach the ground in large pieces. The launches were later resumed. The program continued until 1988, 33 craft in all across its whole history. But Cosmos 954 remained forever the main lesson, and the main argument of those opposed to nuclear reactors in orbit. That's what the price of the space eyes turned out to be. A system without which the carrier killer couldn't take aim one day became a threat itself. Not to a carrier, to a peaceful country, to the Canadian wilds, to a chance person on a lake. A reactor that was supposed to light up targets for the missile swarm fell onto someone else's land and left a radioactive trail over thousands of square kilometers. Chelomey built the system as a single whole: missile, boat, satellite. And that whole system was reliable exactly as far as its weakest link was reliable. The weak link turned out to be a small satellite with a reactor, circling in an orbit where any failure means a fall. The eyes of the carrier killer nearly caused a nuclear emergency off someone else's shore. This isn't often recalled when people speak of the might of the Soviet submarine fleet. And that's a shame, because might always has two sides. A salvo of granites and debris on the Canadian snow, that's one and the same story, one and the same chain of decisions. On frozen Great Slave Lake, that snow melted long ago. But the question remained, what price is it worth paying for a weapon that works only together with a nuclear reactor in orbit? But that's a question for those who made the decisions at the top. And down below, in the fleet headquarters, in the design bureaus, in the compartments of submarines, they asked a different question, more concrete, less philosophical, simple like Gorshkov's arithmetic. Would the carrier get away from that salvo or not? Would it get away or not? 24 supersonic missiles in a single salvo. That sounds like a death sentence. But here's what has to be said plainly before we take the question apart. A salvo of granites has never once in history been fired at a real carrier. Not once. Not in battle, not under conditions close to battle. Everything we know about how it would have worked is design calculations, range firings at target hulks, and the opinions of people who spent their lives studying this weapon. I want to take this question apart honestly, layer by layer, to separate what's been verified from what's a theory and from what remains speculation. Because a legend has grown up around the carrier killer, and that legend is partly earned and partly not. Let's start with what is fact. 24 P-700 Granite missiles are a proven production weapon that stood in service for decades. Each weighs about 7 tons. Speed on the cruise leg, up to 2.5 times the speed of sound at high altitude, around 1.5 Mach near the water's surface. Range on a combined trajectory from 550 to 625 kilometers, depending on the flight profile. The warhead, a penetrator, from 518 to 750 kilograms, sources disagree. Or nuclear, by various accounts from several tens to hundreds of kilotons. The missile is fitted with its own electronic warfare station, quartz, and means of dispensing decoys. All of this is fact, confirmed by many sources. It's also fact that the missiles in a salvo worked as a swarm, dividing targets among themselves, singling out a spotter missile on a high trajectory, a database of ship signatures and memory, priority for the main target. This isn't conjecture. It's a design feature described by the developers and by military specialists alike. Now, the theory, the design intent. The intent was as follows. A salvo of 24 missiles was meant to saturate the air defense of a carrier group. The idea is that air defense has a limit, a finite number of guidance channels, a finite reaction speed, a finite store of interceptor missiles. If 24 supersonic targets enter that system at once, some coming in low, some jamming, some dropping decoys, the system chokes. It can't intercept them all, and the missiles that break through finish off the carrier. This is the designer's logic. It looks convincing on paper. It's backed by calculations that were made in Chalamet's bureau. But, and this is the crucial point, it was never tested under real conditions. Range firings at target hulks aren't a battle with a carrier group. A hulk doesn't jam, doesn't maneuver, doesn't fire back with interceptor missiles. The military historian Alexander Shirakorod, author of several books on the Russian Navy and missile armament, examines the Granite's capabilities in detail in his work. Shirakorod is a man who worked for decades with the documents on the Soviet fleet, and his position is measured. He acknowledges the weapon's power, but doesn't hide its weak points either. It's convenient to look at this problem through his lens, because he falls neither into rapture nor into disparagement. The weak points. There are several, and each deserves a look. First, noise. The Antey is a large boat. Submerged displacement around 24,000 tons, 2 reactors, 2 propeller shafts. It's noticeably louder than the multi-purpose hunter boats of the next generation. In the underwater world, noise is visibility. The louder the boat, the sooner it's found. And a carrier group is ringed by anti-submarine defense. Escort ships with towed sonar arrays, helicopters with dipping hydrophones, patrol aircraft scattering buoys. This whole system is honed for one task: to find the submarine before it reaches the launch line. For the salvo to go, the Antey had to close to firing distance. On a combined trajectory, that's 500 to 600 kilometers. No small margin. But on a low-altitude trajectory, when the missile flies right down by the water and is harder to intercept, the range dropped to 150 or 200 kilometers. And to close to 200 kilometers of a carrier group unnoticed, in a noisy boat, is an extremely difficult task. Second, targeting. We've already spoken of this. Without Legenda, the boat doesn't know where to shoot. And by the mid-90s, Legenda began to degrade. Satellites went out of service. The constellation thinned. By the 2000s, the system had effectively ceased to function. A boat without eyes is powerful but blind. You can fire at maximum range only with current coordinates of the target, and someone has to provide them. If there are no eyes, the firing range shrinks sharply. The boat has to close in and use its own detection means. And closer means more dangerous. Third, and this is already the realm of speculation because it's impossible to verify, the modern air defense of a carrier group. On the enemy side, they didn't stand still either. The Aegis system, deployed on American cruisers and destroyers, is a multi-channel fire control system able to track dozens of targets at once. The latest modification SM-6 interceptor missiles have an active homing head and an intercept range of hundreds of kilometers. The short-range ESSM missiles work at low altitudes. Around a single carrier, there are usually one cruiser and 3 or 4 destroyers, each carrying dozens of interceptors. The question comes down to arithmetic. How many interceptor missiles can a carrier group launch in the time it takes the Granites to reach the target? And will they be enough to intercept all 24? In the 80s, when the Antey was being designed, that arithmetic favored the attacker. There were fewer air defense systems, fewer guidance channels, simpler interceptors. By the 2000s, the balance had shifted. Modern Aegis isn't what it was in the 80s. The number of guidance channels grew, the missiles got smarter, the intercept range increased. Speculation, because no one knows exactly how this clash would look in reality. Maybe Aegis would handle 24 targets. Maybe not, because the Granites come in supersonic, jam, maneuver, and air defense has mere minutes from detection to kill. Maybe some of the missiles would break through. Maybe one would be enough. 750 kilograms of penetrating warhead inside a carrier. No one knows this. And thank God no one knows, because knowing would mean a third world war. Shiro Korad, in his work, formulates a position I consider the most honest. The Granite was a formidable weapon of its time. In the 80s, a salvo of 24 such missiles posed a threat to a carrier group that was extremely hard to counter. The probability of even a few missiles breaking through was high enough for this weapon to be taken seriously. But to call the salvo irresistible is to pass off a design intent as a proven result. There's one more layer that popular articles almost never mention: the nuclear option. If a Granite carries a nuclear warhead, all the air defense arithmetic loses its meaning. You have to intercept every missile to the last one. A single missile that breaks through with a nuclear charge destroys not the carrier, it destroys the whole group at once. Blast wave, electromagnetic pulse, radiation. Within a radius of several kilometers from the detonation point, nothing is left. But here too there's a caveat. The use of tactical nuclear weapons in a local naval battle is a threshold beyond which global nuclear war begins. The Soviet leadership understood this perfectly. The nuclear variant of the Granite existed as a weapon of last resort, an option for a war in which there's nothing left to lose. You can't count on it in an ordinary scenario, because after a nuclear strike, there is no ordinary scenario anymore. Let me try to gather it all together. Without a therefore and without a final verdict, fact. 24 supersonic missiles with collective guidance are the most powerful anti-ship salvo ever mounted on a single carrier platform. This isn't a myth or propaganda, it's hardware that stood in service. Theory. Within the design intent, this salvo was meant to break through a carrier group's air defense by saturation and by the intelligence of the swarm. Calculations back this theory. So did range trials. Speculation. Whether the salvo would break through in a real battle is unknown. It depends on dozens of variables. What air defense the enemy has, at what distance the boat fires, whether there's targeting, on what trajectory the missiles come in, how many of them are functional after launch, what the sea is like, what the jamming environment is. You can model it endlessly, prove it only in battle. But here's what's worth noting. And this isn't speculation, it's an observation. The Americans took the Antey very seriously. Not as a propaganda toy, not as an obsolete monster. Every time a loaf put out into the ocean, it was watched, searched for, escorted. One way to gauge a weapon is to look at how the one it's aimed at treats it. The American Navy behaved as if a Granite salvo were a problem to be solved before it happened, not after. That's indirect but eloquent testimony. And one last thing, the Antey's formidability is measured not only by whether its salvo would break through, it's measured by the resources the enemy spent defending against it. Every time a loaf put to sea, it set off a chain reaction. We spoke of this in the chapter on Gorshkov. Reconnaissance aircraft, anti-submarine ships, rerouting of carrier groups, tens of millions of dollars on countermeasures. Even if we grant that the salvo wouldn't break through, the mere fact that this threat existed cost the enemy dearly. A weapon that works even in silence isn't a myth. It's a strategy. And the myth is the word irresistible. A salvo there's no escaping is a fine formula. And there's a kernel in it. 24 supersonic missiles with collective intelligence were a problem no air defense system in the world could solve with a guarantee. But the guarantee cut the other way too. No one could guarantee the salvo would break through whole. The honest answer? This was a weapon against which there was no reliable defense, but also no reliable proof of its invulnerability. Formidable. Dangerous. Working by its very existence, but untested in battle. One thing we know for certain, if this salvo really did go for real, no one would have any time to think. 24 missiles at a speed of 2.5 Mach cover the last 200 kilometers in a few minutes. A few minutes, from the moment the missiles come out from beyond the horizon to the moment they strike the hull. Between those 2 points lies the entire air defense of the carrier group. Every interceptor missile, every guidance channel, all the experience and all the technology. And all of it has to work flawlessly. In minutes, with no right to a mistake. Those minutes, that's the one thing no one argues about. Minutes. Everything we've talked about up to now, the giant boat, the swarm with its collective mind, the reactor satellites in orbit, Gorshkov's arithmetic, all of it converged into a few minutes. More precisely, for the boat's crew, into 30 seconds. 30 seconds for the sake of which 130 enterprises worked, the designer who didn't live to see the launch, and his pupil who carried the job through to the end. Now I'll try to reconstruct how it was meant to go. Not to invent a battle that never was, but to lay out, step by step, the scenario this whole system was created for. Every element here comes from design documentation and open descriptions, nothing of my own. I'll flag it right away. This is a reconstruction of the intent, not a chronicle of a real event. The start, silence. The boat at depth. The crew at their combat stations. The central post, a cramped compartment packed with instruments, where the commander makes the decision. The target's coordinates have come in, from a Legenda satellite, from a reconnaissance aircraft, or from another source. The carrier group is detected, its course and speed calculated, the data entered into the fire control system. The boat comes onto the launch line. The order to prepare for the salvo. In the flanks, between the light hull and the pressure hull, a process begins that can't be heard from outside. 24 canisters of granite missiles are brought to combat readiness. Each canister is tilted forward at about 45 degrees, each closed by a fairing cap that's part of the light hull. Before launch, the caps open in pairs, 12 caps for 24 missiles. The boat rises to periscope depth. To launch the granites, you have to come up closer to the surface. The missile starts from underwater, but not deep. This is the most vulnerable moment. The boat, which until now hid in the depths, is now closer to the surface, closer to detection. Every second of delay is a second in which the enemy's anti-submarine assets can pick it up. The order, fire, 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, all 24 missiles have to leave their canisters, one after another at short intervals, so the swarm gathers in the air almost at once. Each missile weighs about 7 tons. It exits the canister underwater, breaks through the surface, ignites its solid fuel launch booster, and gains altitude within seconds. The booster is burned out and is jettisoned. The crew's turbojet engine kicks in. The missile settles onto its course. 30 seconds, and the boat's flanks are empty. 24 canisters open, 24 missiles in the air. In the compartments, a settling roar, the vibration from the launches, the smell of the booster's powder gases, which seeps inside the pressure hull, even through the ventilation systems. The boat has fired. Now its task is to go deep immediately and run. 30 seconds on the surface is 30 seconds in which it could have been detected, and within a few minutes, everything the enemy has will arrive at that point. But for the boat, the battle is already over. Everything that follows is the missiles' work. The swarm gathers, 24 granites in the air, and between them the data exchange begins. That very collective guidance system Chelome built. The missiles link up with one another and divide the tasks. The first thing that happens, one of the missiles takes on the spotter's role. It rises above the rest, to an altitude of 14 to 17,000 meters, depending on the trajectory scheme. From there, its radio horizon is far greater. It switches on its radar seeker head and sees what the others don't, the whole enemy formation entire. The carrier in the center, the escort cruisers and destroyers around the perimeter. The spotter passes this picture down to the rest of the swarm. The other 23 go lower, right down by the water, 25 meters above the surface on the final stretch. At this altitude, they're almost impossible to detect in advance. A ship's radar sees a low-flying target only when it comes out from beyond the radio horizon, and that's a mere few tens of kilometers. The defenders have minutes to react. Maybe a minute, maybe less. The swarm knows what it's hitting. Loaded into each missile's memory is a library of ships' radar signatures. How a carrier looks on radar, how a cruiser looks, how a destroyer looks. By the size of the blip, by the character of the reflection, by the place in the formation, the swarm works out the main target, the carrier. The biggest, the most valuable, the most important. The bulk of the missiles are directed at it. The other escort ships get their share, but only after enough has been allotted to the main target. No ship is attacked twice. If the swarm has determined that one missile is assigned to this destroyer, the second goes to another target. No duplication, no waste. Cold machine logic. Each missile to its own target, not one extra hit where enough is already coming. The enemy throws up jamming. It's inevitable. The carrier group's electronic warfare systems begin working the moment the salvo is detected. The airwaves fill with noise, chaff is thrown out, clouds of metal foil that create false blips on radar. Inflatable corner reflectors mimic a ship's silhouette. All of it to make the missiles bite at a decoy and go wide. The swarm answers this. Every granite carries a jamming station, quartz, and means of dispensing its own decoys. The missile doesn't just fly. It wages its own electronic warfare. It filters false blips from real ones, reconfigures, corrects its course. The spotter above keeps giving the overall picture as long as it lives. If the spotter is shot down, by some accounts, its role can be taken over by another missile from the swarm. The swarm reconfigures on the move. The last kilometers. The missiles descend to extremely low altitude and go for their targets at about 1.5 Mach near the surface. On this stretch, the ship's radars detect them, and the last line of defense begins. Interceptor missiles, rapid-fire gun mounts, everything that can shoot, seconds. This is exactly where it's decided whether the swarm breaks through or not. If even a few missiles reach the target, 750 kilograms of penetrating warheads strike the carrier's hull. The granite is designed like an armor-piercing shell. It doesn't detonate on the surface. It punches through the plating and bursts inside the hull, deep in the structure, where the damage is greatest. A few such hits, and a carrier of 100,000 tons displacement loses its fighting ability. It was meant to be exactly this way. Pustintsev drew the ship that would deliver these missiles to the launch line. Chelomey created the missiles that become a swarm in flight. The Legenda satellites provided the target's coordinates. 22 M3 bombers struck from the air at the same time so that the defense would choke. Every element converged into these minutes. Igor Baranov brought all of it into service. The man who took over the project from Pustintsev in '77 carried it to the slipway, to the sea, to the fleet. He knew every compartment, every cable run, every system of this boat. He saw the lead ship, the Arkhangelsk, go out on its first patrol. He knew what that patrol was for. For 30 seconds. For the moment when the commander speaks the order, 24 caps in the flanks open, and 7-ton missiles, one after another, tear through the ocean's surface. For the swarm to rise, gather, and set off toward the horizon, soundless, supersonic, no longer controlled by anyone. On its own, with its own reason, its own library of targets, its own logic of priorities. 24 missiles, each the weight of a truck, flying in formation toward a floating city beyond the horizon. The boat, by this moment, is already at depth. The canisters are empty. In the compartments, the kind of silence that comes only after a roar. The crew has done its work. From here, only to wait. The swarm goes off beyond the horizon, to where it will be decided what all this was built for. A decade and a half of drawings, 130 enterprises, nuclear reactors in orbit, the life of a designer who didn't live to see the launch. 30 seconds of the salvo, and all of it is either justified or it isn't. The swarm goes, the compartment is silent, the ocean closes over the place where, seconds ago, the water boiled from the launch boosters. And then, The era all of this was built for up and ended. It ended, but the boats remained. Of nearly 24 Anteys planned, 11 were built. The last hull of the series left the Sevmash slipway in 1996. Several more hulls stayed on the slipways, unfinished, broken up for scrap, or simply abandoned. The money ran out before the order list did. The 90s hit the submarine fleet harder than any enemy. Funding collapsed, factories stood idle, crews were cut. Boats built as carrier killers sat at the piers with no time at sea, no repairs, no future. Some ships were struck from the fleet and sent for scrapping. Giant steel hulls, inside which crews of 130 had lived not long before, were cut up for metal. Of the 11 built, about 8 remain in service today by open sources. The figure floats. Some boats are in repair, some in modernization, and the fleet doesn't advertise its exact combat strength. But the order of magnitude is that roughly half the originally planned series. Here I'm obliged to speak of one boat from this series that you're surely waiting for. K-141, the Kursk. Yes, it was an Antey. The same Project 949A, the same Sevmash, the same granites in the flanks. On the 12th of August 2000, the Kursk was lost in the Barents Sea during an exercise. 118 crew. I promised at the start that I wouldn't make this tragedy the center of the story, and I won't. The loss of the Kursk is a separate, heavy, not fully closed story that deserves a conversation of its own, not a footnote in a video about a boat's design. Today we're talking about why these ships were built and what they could do. The Kursk was one of them, and that's enough to understand the scale of the loss. The rest, separately. Let's return to the living. The Anteys still in service don't sit idle. The fleet decided not to scrap them, but to rebuild them. The modernization program was designated 949 AM. The essence of the rebuild is radical. The old granites are removed. The missile that was the peak of engineering thought in the 70s had grown obsolete by the 2000s. Heavy, noisy on the cruise, with a range that on a low-altitude trajectory shrinks to 200 kilometers. In place of one granite, 3 new missiles fit into each former tube: Caliber, Onyx, or Zircon. 24 tubes, 3 in each. That's up to 72 missiles on a single boat. In place of 24 granites, up to 72 new missiles. The difference isn't only in number. The Caliber is a versatile cruise missile that can work against both ships and land targets. The Onyx is a supersonic anti-ship missile, a more compact and modern replacement for the granite. The Zircon is hypersonic, the next generation, speeds beyond 5 Mach. The boat turns from a narrow carrier specialist into a versatile strike ship, able to hit targets of any type over thousands of kilometers. The first to go in for modernization was the boat Irkutsk of the Pacific Fleet. After it, by open sources, comes the Chelyabinsk. The work is being carried out in the Far East, at the Zvezda yard in Bolshoi Kamen. The process is a long one. The boat is effectively taken apart from the inside, the launchers, the electronics, the control systems all replaced. This isn't a cosmetic repair, it's a second life. But the most unexpected fate belongs to one hull that never became an Antey in the usual sense. K-329, laid down back in 1992 as an ordinary Antey. Then construction stopped. No money. The unfinished hull stood in the Sevmash Hall for more than 10 years. By the 2000s, they were seriously considering cutting it up for scrap. But in 2012, the ship was relayed to a completely new design, 09852. The former carrier killer became something else, a special-purpose submarine. A carrier of underwater craft and, by open sources, a carrier of the Poseidon system, autonomous underwater vehicles with a nuclear power plant. The boat was given the name Belgorod. In July of 22, it was handed over to the fleet. By length, the Belgorod is the longest submarine in active service in the world. The former Antey hull, with its giant dimensions, turned out to be an ideal platform for a new, entirely different weapon. The Belgorod was commanded from 2015 to 2025 by Captain First Rank Alyokin, Anatoly Sergeyevich, a man who took over an unfinished hull with a 20-year history of standing idle and brought it to the flag. You know what kind of labor that is? To take a ship that was begun under one country, recut under another, and delivered under a third? The Belgorod isn't just a boat with an unusual fate. It's a symbol of how one and the same steel hull can outlive the turning of eras and find itself new work. Alongside the modernization of the Anteys, the fleet is building their replacement. Project 885, the Yasen, multi-purpose nuclear submarines of a new generation. They're quieter, more compact, more modern. They carry the same calibers and zircons, but on a stealthier and faster platform. The tasks that in the 80s were laid on the loaves are gradually passing to the Yasens. This is a natural process. Every generation of ships gives way to the next. But the Anteys haven't gone yet. A modernized ship with 72 missiles on board is a different boat in a different war. Not the one Pustintsev drew, not the one Chelomey made the swarm for. The hull is the same, but the contents are new. The carrier killer became a versatile strike ship. The swarm of granites has passed into the past, and the ship that carried it has remained. And yet there's something about these boats we still don't know to this day. Even after all that's been declassified and published, questions remain to which there is no answer. And that, perhaps, is the most honest part of the story. Honest, because books and articles have been written about this boat, films have been made, and still, to this day, even the numbers about it lie. The Granite's warhead. Some sources write 518 kilograms, others 750. The nuclear variant, from several tens of kilotons to 500. A tenfold spread. That's not a difference in estimates, that's the difference between a tactical charge and a bomb capable of leveling a medium-sized city. And not one person writing for the public domain knows the exact figure. The real effectiveness of the salvo. We went over this in detail, the swarm, the spotter, the jam resistance. It's all logical, all beautiful on paper. But not one granite salvo ever went against a real carrier group. Not one. Range hulks don't jam, don't fire back, don't maneuver. Would the swarm have worked as intended against a real Aegis? Against dozens of interceptor missiles? Against jammers? This we don't know. And let's be honest, better that we never find out. The Poseidon, the system for which the Belgorod was rebuilt, what it can actually do, at what range it works, what the real yield of its charge is, all of this is the realm of guesswork and leaks, not verified fact. Official statements say one thing, Western estimates another, and there's no independent verification. Chelomey died in December of 1984. He created both the missile and the eyes for it. He built the swarm's collective mind into the granite, a thing that in the 70s was hard even to explain to the uninitiated. But the answer to the main question, whether all of this together would have worked in a real battle against a real enemy, Chelomey took with him. He believed it would. There was no way to test it without starting a war. One thing remains. One thing. Silence. She never once fired at the one she was built for. Not once. Not a single boat of this series ever delivered a combat salvo against a carrier group. 24 missiles in the flanks, a swarm with a collective mind, reactor satellites in orbit, 130 enterprises, a designer who didn't live to see the launch, and not one shot at a real target. All their lives, these boats stood loaded. They went out on combat patrols, held their watch in the ocean for months, came back, went out again. Crews, 130 men on each ship, lived for years inside this weapon. They slept beside the missile tubes, ate a few meters from a nuclear reactor, stood their watches in compartments where the air smells of iron and machine oil. They knew their ship like their own body. Knew every valve, every pipeline, every sound that ought to be there, and every one that ought not. And all these years they carried underwater a salvo they never gave. The 30 seconds everything was built for, those 30 seconds never came. Maybe they never came for the very reason that the salvo existed, that the boat stood loaded, that the enemy knew she's there, under the water, and she has 24 reasons not to come any closer. A weapon that works without firing. Whether that's a bitter irony or the highest point of the whole design, each person decides for themselves. Subscribe so that ships like these and people like these don't dissolve into the silence. Without it, there's simply no one to tell their stories. And I have a question for you, a personal one. Did you serve in the Navy? Or maybe someone in your family sailed on loaves like these in the Northern Fleet in the Pacific? Tell it in the comments. Almost no living accounts of these people are left. Books, there are. Reference works, there are. But the voices of those who lived for months inside these ships, there are almost none. If you're one of them, or you know such a person, write. That matters more than any reference work.